My brother is afraid to join the army, and I helped him dodge it. But in the end, he sued me. So here it goes. My name's Alex Harrison. I'm 26, and I just came back to my hometown after grinding it out in the city for the last few years. I had my own apartment, a solid career trajectory, and I'd started carving out a life that felt like mine. But all that got paused when my mom, Jane, called me one night and asked if I could come home. Not for a visit, but for good, or at least for a while. She didn't say it outright at first. It started with the usual "how are you doing" kind of talk, then quickly shifted to how things were falling apart back home. Our family house was at risk of foreclosure, bills were piling up, and then she dropped the real bomb. My younger brother Zach wasn't doing well at all. She said he barely left his room anymore, hadn't been to school in weeks, and was refusing to go through with his military service. I hadn't seen Zach in person for over a year. Last time I visited, he seemed fine, quiet, sure, but we'd always been different that way. I was the go-getter, the one who moved out as soon as I could. He was softer, more introspective. But hearing how bad things had gotten, I don't know, something just hit me. Guilt maybe. Or some deeply ingrained idea that family comes first. I packed up my life in a week. Sublet my apartment, gave notice at my job even though I'd just been offered a minor promotion, and drove 6 hours back to the house I grew up in. Pulling into the driveway, everything felt smaller. The paint was peeling. One of the front steps looked like it might cave in. The yard was overgrown, and the mailbox had duct tape wrapped around it like that was going to keep it from falling over. Mom looked older than I remembered, tired in a way I hadn't seen before. She hugged me like she was afraid I'd disappear again. Zach didn't come out to greet me. She said he was asleep, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. I told her I'd help. I didn't even hesitate. Maybe I should have thought it through more, but it felt like the right thing. I moved back into my old room, which still had my high school posters on the wall, and started making calls the next day. First the bank, to find out what exactly was going on with the mortgage. Then I called around for work. Took less than 2 weeks to land a position at the local fire station. It wasn't what I did before, no desk, no city skyline. But I'd had my certification for years and figured the hands-on work would be good for me. The house had 2 months of payments left before the bank would begin repossession procedures. I paid one of them from my savings. The second I managed after my first month's paycheck came through. Not a lot left after that, but I wasn't about to let us lose the house if I could help it. Meanwhile, Zach didn't say more than a handful of words to me for weeks. I tried everything. Took him out to lunch. Asked him to come for walks. Played old games we used to mess around with when we were kids. Nothing worked. He just stared at the floor, shrugged at most of my questions, and sometimes didn't even come out of his room for meals. I started doing research, talking to a local therapist, and eventually convinced him to go to one session. Just one. I don't know what they talked about, but he was quieter than usual after. And that's saying something. On top of all that, I started working with a lawyer in town. This older guy named Mr. Brennan, who'd been helping families in town since before I was born. We went through the deed, the lien, everything. There were some options: bankruptcy, negotiating a forbearance, maybe even getting some government assistance since Mom was technically unemployed. But every path came with a price, and none of them were simple. I found myself juggling bills, calling Zach's school to try and get him back on track, talking to lawyers, and working 12-hour shifts at the station, sometimes even pulling doubles. There were nights I didn't sleep, just lay awake staring at the ceiling trying to figure out how the hell we were going to stay afloat. Still, I kept telling myself it was worth it. That family mattered more than anything else. That I was doing the right thing, even if it meant losing everything I'd built in the city. Because blood is blood, right? And that's how I ended up back here, neck deep in a life I thought I'd left behind, carrying the weight of a family that felt like it might fall apart if I let go for even a second. Zach had always been quiet, but lately it was something different. There was a tension around him I couldn't ignore, a kind of nervous energy that clung to the air whenever he entered a room. He barely spoke to me still, even though I'd been back for over a month. At first I figured it was just depression or the pressure of everything going on, but something in the way he avoided eye contact or suddenly disappeared for hours without saying a word started to eat at me. I'd ask where he'd been, and he'd mumble something vague. Out. With friends. Didn't matter. But it did matter, and the more I watched him, the more I started to feel like he was hiding something. One evening I caught him slipping back into the house around 11. He froze when he saw me in the kitchen, mid-sip of coffee, and for a split second there was a flicker of guilt across his face. I asked him straight up where he'd been, and he immediately got defensive, accused me of spying on him, said I wasn't his dad. That one stung more than I let on. I told him I wasn't trying to control him, I just wanted to understand what was going on. He pushed past me, muttering something about how I wouldn't understand anyway, and disappeared into his room. The next morning, I noticed the Wi-Fi data usage on the router was through the roof. I hadn't touched the setup in years, but I knew enough to poke around. Most of the traffic was encrypted, some going to weird domains I didn't recognize. One of them stood out, something with a name like MetaQuant Futures or whatever scammy nonsense these crypto sites go by. I Googled it, and sure enough, forums were flooded with warnings. Classic pump and dump, zero regulation, promises of huge returns, and referral bonuses. I knew Zach was desperate, but this was worse than I expected. When I confronted him about it, he blew up. Said it was none of my business, that he had it under control, that Marcus told him it was a guaranteed win. That name hit me like a truck. Marcus. I hadn't heard that name in years. They were close in middle school, inseparable, actually, but even back then, Marcus always had that manipulative streak. The kind of kid who could lie with a straight face and make you feel like the crazy one for questioning him. I hadn't realized they were still in touch. That same week, I started noticing weird activity in Mom's checking account. I'd been helping her manage bills, logging in to pay utilities, and one day I noticed a $400 withdrawal. Then a $275 one. Cash, always from the same ATM across town. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off like it was nothing. Just groceries, or a few things she needed. I let it go once. The second time I pressed again, and she changed the story. Said she was helping a neighbor with medical expenses. I knew she was lying. Then I caught her going through the mail early one morning before anyone else was up. She had a stack in her hands, and I watched from the hallway as she took 3 envelopes, 2 from the bank, 1 from a loan office, and slid them into the bottom drawer of the hall desk. I waited until she left for the store, then pulled them out. One was a final notice from the bank regarding a missed mortgage payment, the second a credit card statement with a balance way higher than she'd admitted to, and the third a demand letter from a debt collector. When she came back, I confronted her about it. She didn't even try to deny it, just sighed and said, "You have enough to worry about, Alex." I didn't want to add more. I told her I couldn't help if I didn't know the truth. She shook her head and said, "You've already done more than enough. Just let me handle this." But that didn't make sense. I was the one paying the bills now. She wasn't working. She depended on me, and yet she was acting like I was some outsider poking around in things I shouldn't touch. Then came the documents for the house. Or rather, the lack of them. Mr. Brennan had asked for the full deed paperwork so he could figure out what could be renegotiated. I told Mom, and she nodded, said she'd dig them up that weekend. A week went by. I reminded her. She said she'd misplaced the file and needed time to find it. Another few days passed. Then she said maybe it had been accidentally thrown out during the last cleaning. Every answer more evasive than the last. That's when I knew something was deeply wrong. Between Zach's secretive behavior, Mom's financial lies, and the missing paperwork, it felt like I'd walked into a house where everyone was playing their own game, hiding their own disasters, hoping I wouldn't notice. But I was noticing. I saw the cracks in the walls, both literal and metaphorical. And as much as I wanted to believe I could patch everything together on my own, the feeling in my gut told me the worst was still coming. The letter came on a Tuesday. Just a plain white envelope with a courthouse return address and my mom's full name typed neatly across the front. I wasn't snooping. It was in the usual pile of mail on the kitchen table. What caught my eye was the bold black print in the upper left corner. Notice of property transfer and public sale. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. I sat down right there and read it once, then twice, and still couldn't make sense of it. According to the court, the house, our house, was no longer in my mother's name. It had been signed over 6 months ago in what looked like a quiet, private transaction to someone named Shelby Morgan. The name meant nothing to me at first, but it sounded familiar in that irritating, back-of-the-head way. The letter was clear. The house had already been listed for public sale, and a hearing date was set in less than 3 weeks. I didn't even realize I was gripping the letter so tightly until my knuckles started to ache. I walked straight into the living room where my mom was folding laundry and held it up without saying a word. She didn't even look surprised. Not confused, not panicked, just tired. She glanced at the paper and said, "You weren't supposed to see that." I didn't raise my voice, though every part of me wanted to scream. I just asked, calmly as I could, "Who is Shelby Morgan?" That's when the color drained from her face. She looked away, started folding a shirt that was already folded. "She's someone who helped us," she said. "Helped us how?" I pressed. No answer. "You signed the house over to a complete stranger?" "Without telling me." I asked. "She's not a stranger," she snapped suddenly. "She's Marcus' partner." And just like that, everything clicked. Marcus. The same Marcus who dragged Zach into whatever sketchy crypto pit he'd been losing money in. The same Marcus I never trusted, even when we were kids. Shelby Morgan wasn't some innocent third party. She was part of whatever mess Marcus and Zach were tangled up in. "You gave the house to Marcus' girlfriend?" I asked, disbelief heavy in my voice. "She's not just his girlfriend," Mom replied sharply. "They've been together for years." She's family. That last word made something twist in my chest. Family. She used that word like it still meant something, like it still included me, even after making the biggest decision about our future behind my back. I asked her again why she didn't tell me, why she kept pretending the house was still ours, why she let me sink my savings into mortgage payments when she knew it was already gone. She turned on me then, in a way I hadn't seen before. Because you think you're in charge of everything now, she said. Because every time I make a decision, you question it like I'm some child who doesn't know what she's doing. I stood there stunned. You sold the house, Mom. You signed it away to a con artist's girlfriend. And you didn't tell me. I'm not questioning you like a child. I'm trying to save what's left of our life here. You think this house is your responsibility, she said, her voice rising. But it's not. You came back and decided you had to fix everything. Well, not everything needs your fixing. She walked out of the room before I could say anything else. After that, she started avoiding me. She left early in the mornings, sometimes not coming home until after dark. She ignored my texts, dodged my calls, and when we crossed paths in the hallway, she barely looked at me. She started calling my questions interrogations, accused me of trying to control the family. Zach wouldn't talk to me either. Every time I tried to bring it up, he clammed up or left the room entirely. It was like the two of them had silently closed ranks, and I was the outsider. The one trying to hold the house together was now the problem. But the letter was real. The sale was real. And the name Shelby Morgan was printed in bold on every page. It all came together faster than I expected and uglier than I was ready for. I'd been trying to get answers for weeks, pushing Zach, circling around Marcus, digging through paperwork I had no business finding, but none of it prepared me for what I stumbled onto by accident. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, and I couldn't sleep. I'd been lying in bed staring at the ceiling, my head full of Shelby Morgan, disappearing money, forged deeds, and that court letter burning a hole in my thoughts. I went to get water from the kitchen, and on the way back, noticed the light in Zach's room creeping out from under the door. I knocked. No answer. Then I heard his chair creak. He was awake. I pushed the door open, and he immediately slammed his laptop shut and tried to act casual, but he was pale. I didn't say anything. I just stared at him until he finally sighed and mumbled, "Can I help you?" I asked him straight out. Was he hiding something from me about the house, about Marcus, about the army? He didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something about minding my own business. Later that day, I checked the printer in the living room for something I'd sent from my phone, and that's when I saw it. At the bottom of the tray was a half-printed document, pages curled and faded at the edges. It looked like a medical report, and Zach's name was on it. It claimed he had a serious neurological disorder, but I'd seen him every day for months. He wasn't sick. There was no diagnosis, no medications, no symptoms. I checked the date. It was from 3 months ago, right when he was supposed to start processing his paperwork for the draft. I went back through my emails and found another document, one my mother had scanned to me when I asked about Zach's school registration. It had the same doctor's signature. I Googled the name. There was no such clinic. The address was a UPS store. That's when I knew. I found the rest of it in a folder buried behind the old books in Zach's closet. A list of names. People I didn't recognize, but all with similar fake documents. All clients of Marcus' so-called service. He'd been running a full-on evasion scheme, getting young guys out of mandatory service by faking disabilities. And the part that broke me? It was all funded through loans taken out in my mother's name. There were applications, signatures, copies of her ID, dozens of them. The dates lined up perfectly with the missing money from her account, the cash withdrawals, the mounting debt she pretended didn't exist. I couldn't breathe when I realized what I was holding. This wasn't just about Zach being afraid. This wasn't one panic decision. It was a long, organized scam, and my mother had been part of it. Not just aware, complicit. When I confronted her, she didn't even flinch. I laid everything out on the table, the forged files, the fake doctor, the loans. She stood there in the kitchen like she'd been waiting for this moment. I asked her how long she'd been helping Marcus, and she said, flatly, long enough to protect my son. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I asked her if she even realized what kind of trouble she was in, what kind of risk this put Zach and herself into. I asked her how she could lie to me while I was busting my back to keep the lights on, keep the roof over our heads. She didn't answer, just turned around and started wiping the counter like nothing had happened. I told her I wasn't going to let this go, that if she didn't come clean, I would. That's when she looked at me like I was a stranger. Her voice was sharp, bitter in a way I'd never heard before. You are not one of us, Alex. You don't realize how hard it was for us while you were gone. That stopped me cold. I asked her what that meant, but she just kept going. Said I'd left, that I'd built my life in the city, made my money, lived in some high-rise while they were here drowning. She said I couldn't understand what it was like. Watching your youngest child unravel. Watching Marcus step in when no one else would. She called him loyal. She said he did what had to be done when I was too far away to care. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She made it sound like I'd abandoned them. Like coming home, paying off the mortgage, holding the family together. It didn't matter, because I hadn't been there in the years before it fell apart. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab Zach and shake him until he understood what this would cost him. But mostly I just wanted her to take it back. But she didn't. She looked at me like I was the enemy. And that was the moment I realized, whatever family I thought I was saving didn't exist anymore. They showed up early in the morning, before I even had a chance to make coffee. 2 men in dark jackets. No smiles, no hesitation, just badges and a direct question. "Are you Alex Harrison?" I nodded, still half asleep, and before I could ask what was going on, one of them said they were from the military prosecutor's office and needed to speak to me regarding an ongoing investigation into forged medical records and tax evasion connected to avoidance of military service. I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at them, the words not quite registering. Then one of them handed me a folder with a copy of a document I'd never seen before in my life. Except my signature was on it. I don't remember how long I stood there staring at that page. It was a fake medical clearance form, identical in format to the ones I'd already found, except this one had my name and signature at the bottom, as if I'd co-signed or verified it. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. I tried to tell them I'd never signed anything like that someone must have forged it, but the words felt useless even as they left my mouth. They asked if I knew Marcus Lockwood. I said yes, that he was a childhood friend of my brother's, but I hadn't spoken to him directly in years. Then they asked about Shelby Morgan, and again I said yes. She now apparently owned our house. One of them nodded like that detail confirmed something. They said they'd been tracking a network of forged medical documents used to avoid the draft, many of them paid for through loans taken out in the names of relatives or guardians. They had reason to believe Marcus was orchestrating the scheme, but so far, no one was talking, including the people closest to him. I told them I had no part in it, that I'd only found out about the fake documents recently. They asked how recently. I told them a few weeks. They asked if I'd reported it. I said no. One of the men looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Then you understand how this looks, Mr. Harrison." They didn't arrest me, not that day, but they left me with a formal notice. I was under investigation and could be called to testify. They said it would help if I provided anything I had, documents, communications, anything that could show I wasn't involved. I stood in the doorway long after they were gone, the folder still in my hand, my name printed in block letters over a signature I didn't write. I found Zach in the garage, pretending to fix the weed whacker. He wouldn't look at me. I held the document in front of him and said, "You know what this is?" He stared at the wall. I asked him again. "Nothing. Zach, they're saying I'm part of this. They think I forged this, that I'm working with Marcus." Still nothing. Just a quiet shrug, like it didn't matter. I wanted to shake him, scream at him, force him to care. But he just kept staring at the same damn spot on the wall. I went inside, furious, shaking, and that's when Mom cornered me in the hallway. Her face was pale, and her voice was low, panicked, but still trying to sound composed. She said, "Alex, we need to talk." I didn't want to hear it. But then she said, "I need you to take responsibility." I thought I heard her wrong. She said it again, slower this time. "If they pin this on Zach, it's over for him. He'll be arrested. He'll have a record. He might even be charged under military law. He's not built for prison, Alex." I stepped back like she'd slapped me. "You want me to go down for this?" I asked, stunned. "You want me to confess to something I didn't do?" She said I was stronger, that I had a better chance of getting a deal. She said I could spin it, say I was just trying to help him, that it was all one mistake, that they'd go easier on me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You helped forge those papers," I said. "You let Marcus use your name for loans. You lied to me. You let me pay off debt on a house you didn't even own anymore. And now you want me to take the fall." Her voice cracked. I was protecting my son. I looked at her and said, "I'm your son." She didn't answer. That silence told me everything. The interrogation didn't last long, but it was enough. A few hours in a gray, windowless room at the county office building, answering questions I didn't know how to answer without lying or incriminating people I once thought I was protecting. The prosecutors weren't aggressive, not at first, but there was a cold precision to their questions that made it clear they already knew more than they were letting on. They weren't asking if I had anything to hide. They were waiting to see if I'd admit what they suspected. When they slid another document across the table, a scanned affidavit supposedly signed by me, stating that Zach had been under neurological care since high school, I didn't even flinch. I knew by then that I'd been set up. I just stared at the signature, my name written in that slightly crooked, almost convincing version of my handwriting, and felt something in me go completely still. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced the living room for hours, the house dark and quiet, except for the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Zach was probably pretending to sleep, his door shut tight like always. Mom was out, again, with no explanation. It didn't matter anymore. I finally accepted what I'd been trying not to believe since the day I came back home. They didn't just lie to me. They used me. They watched me pour my money, my time, and my life into saving a home that no longer belonged to us, into shielding a brother who had already let me take the fall, into fixing a family that had no problem sacrificing me to protect itself. The next morning I called an attorney. I didn't even hesitate. His name was Curtis Dunlap, someone I went to high school with who had gone off to law school in Chicago and returned a few years ago to open his own practice. When I explained the situation, every last bit of it, he didn't blink. He just nodded and said, "It's ugly, but it's actionable." We filed a civil suit against my mother 3 days later. Fraud, forgery, financial damages. The total amount wasn't even the point anymore, though Curtis calculated it down to the last dollar. Mortgage payments I made on a property she no longer owned, loans I'd covered that were taken out in her name, the reputational damage from the forged documents bearing my signature. I could have left it at that, but I added a claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress because I wanted it on paper. I wanted it recorded somewhere official that what she did broke something real. When the news got out, it was like dropping a grenade in the middle of the town square. People I'd known my whole life started whispering behind my back. Some were supportive, quietly, cautiously, but most weren't. They said things like, "You can't do that to your own mother," or, "No matter what happened, it's still family." Some old friends from school stopped returning texts. Others left comments on social media about how disappointed they were. One even told me to man up and take the hit, because that's what family does. I ignored them all. A week after the lawsuit was filed, I got a subpoena, not from my mother's attorney, but from the military prosecutor's office. I was being called to testify in the ongoing investigation into fraudulent exemptions and evasion schemes. The language was sterile, professional, and legally airtight. But the meaning was clear. They were taking this seriously now, and they saw me not as a bystander, but as someone too close to the center to ignore. I stared at the subpoena for a long time. Then I folded it and placed it in a folder with everything else: bank letters, forged documents, court notices. It didn't feel like justice. Not yet. But it was something. It was a start. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Military court felt different from civil court. More structured, less emotion, like every movement had a procedure behind it. I sat at the table in the front, my folder thick with evidence, waiting to be called. My palms were damp the entire time, but my mind was clear. I knew exactly what I was going to say, and I had the documents to back up every word. When I was finally sworn in and asked to give my testimony, I started from the beginning. I walked the court through every step. How I returned home, how I took over the house payments, how I found forged documents and noticed suspicious transactions. I described Zach's strange behavior, the appearance of Shelby Morgan, and how the house had quietly been signed away without my knowledge. Then I submitted the hard evidence. First, I handed over audio recordings, conversations I'd had with my mother where she referenced taking out loans because Zach needed help, and another where she asked me to take the blame just until things calmed down. I made it clear those recordings weren't altered. Curtis had them authenticated ahead of time. Then came the screenshots, text messages between Marcus and Zach, passed to me by someone I used to work with who had mutual friends with Marcus. The texts made it clear they were organizing fake diagnoses, using recycled templates from a shady Telegram group. In one message, Marcus literally joked about renting out Alex's name again if we need a clean adult cosign. I provided my bank records next. Statements showing the withdrawals, always in round amounts, always pulled from ATMs across town. I showed where Jane had authorized a series of microloans in my name without my consent. I'd paid off 3 of them thinking they were connected to old utilities bills. They weren't. She'd listed my name as the recipient on the loan paperwork, forged my signature, and used the funds for their scheme. The final blow came from someone I didn't expect. A guy named Reggie, one of the kids Marcus had helped avoid service, testified in the same session. He'd been caught a few months earlier when one of his documents didn't hold up under review. Under pressure, he flipped. Said Marcus sold the fake records for thousands, offered discounts if the client could pull in more referrals. Reggie named Zach directly. Said Zach walked him through the whole process, even helped him apply for a fake medical evaluation under the same alias clinic that showed up on Zach's file. The courtroom was dead silent by the time he finished. When my lawyer stood and gave the closing statement, there wasn't much left to say. He simply asked the panel to look at the volume of evidence, to consider the sheer level of deception I had been subjected to. Then he asked them to consider the damage it had caused not only to me, but to the integrity of a system that depends on truth and accountability. The panel deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the presiding officer stated that I was released from any and all liability. I was officially cleared of wrongdoing in the case of fraudulent exemption and tax evasion. But it didn't end there. The judge ordered that all submitted materials be turned over to the military prosecutor's office for further criminal investigation. That meant Jane. That meant Zach. That meant Marcus. I sat back in the chair as the decision was read out, feeling both drained and strangely hollow. I wasn't celebrating. There was nothing to celebrate. But I wasn't carrying the weight of their lies anymore. That was over. It was 2 weeks after the hearing when the second blow landed, and this one was even harder to process than the first. I was still dealing with the fallout, court documents, legal consultations, the lawsuit against my mother moving forward, when I got a call from Curtis. He didn't sound like himself. He just said, "You're going to want to sit down." I didn't ask questions. I just listened. It turned out Marcus wasn't just some scumbag peddling fake documents and running crypto scams in his spare time. He was working with the state. Not officially, not with a badge or a title, but he was listed in internal files as a classified source. An informant. Someone embedded in communities that were considered at risk for non-compliance with service laws. His job was to identify, engage, and extract names. And he did exactly that. He built the whole operation. Those fake medical forms, the Telegram groups, the peer-to-peer recruiting model, not just to make money, but to collect data. Every person who reached out, every message sent, every form submitted was saved. He turned that information over to someone higher up. In exchange, he got immunity and bonuses. They found all of it in his apartment. Laptops, flash drives, a locked file cabinet with rows of physical folders. Dozens of them. Names, addresses, ages, medical histories, real and fake. Signed statements. Photos, copies of IDs, screenshots of group chats. And right there, near the front of the stack, was a folder labeled with my name. Alex Harrison. I stared at the scanned images of it for a long time after Curtis forwarded them. The folder had a full timeline of my return home, my employment status at the fire station, notes on my movements, even timestamps for when I accessed certain websites from our Wi-Fi. There were sections labeled useful asset and potential leverage, family dependency. My heart dropped when I saw that. I hadn't just been used. I'd been watched. The press got hold of it fast. Some freelance journalist in the Capitol leaked part of a report confirming that the Ministry of Internal Oversight had approved a pilot program that used informants like Marcus to infiltrate evasion networks. The angle was framed like a national security issue, but public response was a mess. News segments ran with headlines like "Betrayal from Within" and "How Far is Too Far." One paper ran a full-page piece that included a redacted version of my dossier. My name wasn't blacked out enough. People recognized me. I started getting emails from reporters, most asking if I'd give a statement, some asking if I knew Marcus was a plant. One of them wanted to know if I'd known Zach was being used as bait. I didn't respond to any of them. What was I going to say? That I'd walked straight into their setup thinking I was helping my family, while Marcus sat back collecting names and laughing about it. But the worst part wasn't the press. It was the realization that Zach had to have known. Maybe not from the start. Maybe not in the early days. But by the time things were really moving, when Marcus was showing up late at night and dropping off files, when money was being shifted around in coded transfers, he knew. And he said nothing. I wasn't just framed. I was marked, studied, filed away, like a problem to be dealt with later. They came for her just after sunrise. 2 unmarked cars pulled into the driveway, and within minutes, Jane was in handcuffs on the porch where she used to sit in the evenings and water her dying plants. She didn't resist. She didn't say a word. She just stared straight ahead, her hands trembling slightly as they read her the charges: financial fraud, conspiracy to commit identity theft, unauthorized use of personal data, and multiple counts of facilitating a fraudulent benefit scheme. I watched from across the street. I didn't move. I didn't try to talk to her. I just stood there and let it happen. Neighbors peeked from their windows. One woman stood on her lawn in a robe, arms crossed, watching like it was a soap opera. No one said anything to me. Not that day. By the time I got back inside, the house already felt like it belonged to someone else. Jane's coffee mug was still on the counter, half full, and her slippers sat by the door. But she was gone. Not off running errands, or visiting some friend, or even hiding in her room. Gone in a way that didn't come back. Zach didn't wait around to see it unfold. 2 days before her arrest, he disappeared. I came home from work and found his room empty. No note, no call. Just gone. I knew he wasn't just visiting someone. His laptop was wiped. His clothes, his phone, his documents, everything that mattered was missing. Within a week, He was officially listed as wanted for questioning. I watched his name crawl across the bottom of a news broadcast, under a headline about an expanding criminal network tied to military evasion and financial crimes. They showed an old photo of him from high school, smiling with that same half-aware look he always had. No one came to the house after that. Not family, not friends. My phone didn't ring unless it was someone from the prosecutor's office or a reporter. I became the only one left who still had a face the public could attach to all of it, and so I made the choice to talk. Not to clear their names, because I wasn't going to pretend they were innocent, but to explain, to tell the truth. I gave 3 interviews, one for local radio, one for a regional TV outlet, and one for a national paper. I didn't dramatize anything. I told them exactly what happened, how I came home to help, how I paid off debts that weren't mine, how I was manipulated, lied to, set up, how the people I loved most watched me walk into a trap they helped build. I answered every question. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. Some people believed me. Some didn't. One headline called me the betrayed son. Another said I was playing the victim to dodge accountability. The comments were worse, half of them calling me brave, the other half calling me a disgrace. Someone even mailed a letter to the station where I work, telling them to fire me for being part of a corrupt family. I read it twice, then tossed it in the trash. I stopped trying to win over public opinion after that. The truth was simple. There was no family anymore. Not the one I came back to save. Jane was awaiting trial. Zach was in the wind. And I was the only one left standing, not because I was stronger, but because I refused to lie. The rest had already burned. I left the state 6 months after Jane's arrest. There wasn't a goodbye, no last walk through the neighborhood, no sentimental drive past the places I used to haunt as a teenager. I packed up what little I hadn't already sold, rented a truck, and crossed the border without telling a single soul where I was going. I didn't know anyone that anymore. Not after what had happened. I changed my last name first. Legally, cleanly, and without fanfare. It was strange at first, seeing the new name on my ID, hearing it called out at appointments or job interviews, but it started to fit. Like a shirt that felt stiff when you first put it on, but wore in after a few weeks. I had to let the Harrison name go. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because it had been turned into something else. Something people whispered about. Something people crossed the street to avoid. I needed to disappear from that shadow. The compensation came slowly. Most of it was from the settlement tied to the lawsuit against my mother, but some of it was from the state. Quiet money. No press release. No big check presentation. Just a bank deposit with a memo line that read case closure adjustment. I didn't touch it for a while. I left it sitting there while I tried to figure out what a future could even look like after everything had collapsed. The job came through a contact from one of the agencies involved in the investigation. I wasn't recruited, exactly, but someone offered to forward my resume, and the next thing I knew, I was sitting in a quiet office filling out paperwork. I started working with a support division connected to military personnel welfare, case management, outreach, fraud detection. It was ironic, maybe even a little pathetic, that after all I'd been through, I'd end up in a job that helped the very system that had nearly swallowed me. But I wanted to be there. I wanted to help people who weren't trying to cheat the system, people who just got lost in it. For the first time in years, I started to feel stable. I had a quiet apartment, a routine, co-workers who didn't know my past. My name wasn't in headlines anymore. No one recognized me in the grocery store. I went to work, I came home, I slept. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd put enough distance between me and the wreckage of that house to finally breathe again. Then she showed up. Her name was Deborah Carlisle. She used to be Jane's closest friend, part of that tight little circle of PDA mothers and charity event regulars who treated their kids' lives like PR campaigns. She'd moved out of state years ago after her divorce, or at least that's what I'd heard. I hadn't seen or thought about her in a decade. But there she was, sitting on a bench outside my office building one afternoon, legs crossed, sunglasses on, like she'd been waiting for me. I knew her immediately. That stiff posture, that perfectly still smile that always seemed more like a threat than a greeting. She didn't say hello. She just looked me up and down and said, "You look good for someone who tore his own family apart." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She stood up, handed me a manila envelope, and said, "You think you're safe with your new name, your little government job? You're not. I know what happened. I know what you buried." I asked her what she wanted. She smiled and said, "A little respect, and a little insurance." Inside the envelope were copies, scans of old emails, photographs of documents, even a copy of the initial subpoena with my name on it, highlighted like it was some smoking gun. None of it proved anything illegal. None of it showed wrongdoing. But it was enough to stir doubt. Enough to start rumors again if she handed it off to the right person. She said she could make the past come back if I didn't cooperate. When I asked what she meant by that, She just smiled and said, "You'll know when the time comes. I just wanted to remind you that some of us still remember who you really are." Then she walked away. And just like that, the past I'd worked so hard to bury followed me to my new life, sat down beside me, and made itself comfortable again. It had been just over a year since I left everything behind. The trial was over. The scandal had faded from the news cycle, and Jane was still awaiting sentencing after a long string of delays and legal maneuvering. Zach had vanished off the grid like smoke, last seen in some grainy footage from a bus station in El Paso. I assumed, or maybe just hoped, that I would never see him again. But then he came back. I didn't find out from the police or the press. I found out from my lawyer, Curtis, who called me out of the blue with a tightness in his voice I hadn't heard since the day he told me about Marcus. "Zach filed a civil suit against you this morning," he said, claiming emotional distress, defamation, and evidence tampering. And he's hired an attorney. At first I thought it was a joke, a sick one. But Curtis didn't joke. Not about this. He sent me the documents, 60 pages of claims, accusations, and carefully written nonsense. According to the suit, I'd intentionally ruined Zach's life, manipulated evidence, and conspired to damage his reputation. The filing described him as a young man suffering from complex trauma who was exploited by his older brother for personal and professional gain. I stared at the language. The same kid who forged medical records, ran scams with Marcus, and fled a federal investigation was now trying to paint himself as the victim. And me? I was cast as the abuser. But what got under my skin wasn't the lawsuit. It was the lawyer he brought with him, Grant Teller. I knew the name. Teller wasn't a courtroom lawyer. He was a media figure, a strategist, someone who made his name taking lost causes and spinning them into public redemption arcs. He didn't win in court so much as win outside of it, through headlines, appearances, viral interviews. He turned liars into underdogs, fraudsters into misunderstood heroes. He didn't care about facts. He cared about narrative. Within a week, Teller had done exactly what he was known for. There was a podcast interview where Zach told his side of the story. A sympathetic piece in a second-tier political magazine titled, "When Justice Becomes Vengeance, The Alex Harrison Problem." Old rumors resurfaced. Selectively edited clips from my testimony started circulating online. I even saw a photo of myself outside the courthouse from last year, snapped at an unflattering angle, slapped with the caption, "He walked free while his brother's life fell apart." People started reaching out again, some with support, others with hate. A former coworker forwarded me an email that someone had sent anonymously to my boss, suggesting I was under a new investigation. I wasn't. But the message had enough legal terms and vague accusations that it did what it was meant to do. It cast doubt. Curtis told me we could fight it, that there was no legal basis for the claims, that we had more than enough documentation to show Zach was the one who fled justice, not me. But he also warned me this wasn't just about the courtroom. It was about public perception. And public perception, these days, was slippery. Teller didn't need to win in court. He just needed to create a story people wanted to believe. And so here I was again, not fighting for money, not even fighting for peace, fighting for my name, for the right to walk into a room and not have to explain myself, for the chance to live a life that wasn't shaped by the mistakes and betrayals of people who carried my blood but none of my loyalty. It wasn't just about surviving this time. It was about not letting Zach rewrite the truth, not letting him wear the face of the victim after everything he did. Not letting someone like Teller turn my life into a cautionary tale for someone else's benefit. I'd already lost one version of myself. I wasn't about to lose the rest. They called me to the stand in the final hour of the final day. By then, most of the courtroom already knew the shape of the story, at least the version that had survived the noise. But I knew this moment mattered. Not for the verdict, but for the record, for the truth. I sat down, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. I'd been through too much to be afraid of a room like that. The judge asked me to recount everything. I didn't rush. I started from the beginning. The day I got the call from my mother. The day I left the life I'd built behind to come home and save a house that was already gone. I talked about Zach, about the silence, about the lies that slowly piled up until I couldn't breathe under them. I described the fake documents, the forged signatures, the way Marcus operated like a ghost with a pen and a target list. I explained how I found out that the house wasn't ours anymore. How the name Shelby Morgan appeared one day like it had been waiting for its cue. I told them how I was asked, no, begged, to take the fall, how my signature was stolen, how my own family treated my honesty like a liability. I said their names without hesitation. Jane Harrison, Zach Harrison, Marcus Lockwood. I didn't add venom. I didn't need to. The facts carried the weight on their own. Then I said what I came to say. I don't hate them, I told the court. But I'm done protecting people who would burn me to keep themselves warm. I've spent years defending myself from things I didn't do, and I've lost things I'll never get back. Time, trust, peace. But I stood here today not because I want revenge. I stood here because I believe the truth still matters. Because blood is not an excuse for betrayal. Because family, real family, doesn't throw you to the wolves when it gets hard. Family shows up. Family tells the truth, even when it's messy. Especially when it's messy. I let that settle in the air. Then I looked directly at Zach. He wouldn't meet my eyes, and said, "You wanted to hurt me. Not just legally. Publicly. Personally. You came back not to make peace, but to rewrite the past. But the past doesn't change. You can lie about it, distort it, shout over it. But the truth is louder than all of that once it's given the space to breathe." When I stepped down, the courtroom was silent. An hour later, the court dismissed Zach's lawsuit in full. The judge's statement was short, clear, and final. There was no basis for emotional distress. No evidence of tampering. No credibility in the claims. The case was closed. That same afternoon, word came down that Marcus had accepted a plea deal. 6 years in federal prison with no chance of parole. His files, his deals, his manipulation of state programs were now the centerpiece of an entirely different investigation. Whatever protection he once had was gone. And just like that, it was over. No more interviews. No more subpoenas. No more courtroom benches with my name at the center of someone else's chaos. For the first time in years, I was free. I walked out of that courthouse and didn't look back. I didn't stop to wonder where Zach went. I didn't check the news. I didn't call anyone. I just got in my car, closed the door, and sat there with both hands on the wheel, breathing like I hadn't breathed in years. That's my story.